On the morning of October 17, 2022, at Gate B14 of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Shaquille O'Neal stood at the entrance to a jet bridge in a coat that did not fit him. Not in the way that clothes sometimes don't fit large men, too short in the sleeve, too narrow across the shoulder. This coat was wrong in every dimension simultaneously. It was a thin olive green field parka, the kind sold in Army surplus stores for $30, built for a man perhaps 5'10" and 170 pounds. On Shaq, it reached his mid-torso. The sleeves ended 4 inches above his wrists. The zipper ran to somewhere around his sternum and stopped. He was wearing it open because it could not be closed. He had a carry-on bag in his right hand. He was wearing plain dark jeans and white sneakers and no jewelry, and he looked, objectively, like a man who had gotten dressed in the dark from someone else's closet. He was in line for a 6:40 a.m. departure to Los Angeles. The flight was already 22 minutes delayed. The gate was full, and the woman at the jet bridge door, whose name badge read Marlene, 19 years of service, was looking at him the way someone looks at a problem they have decided how to handle before they fully understand it. 3 things were already in the room before she spoke. First, stitched into the inside collar of the olive parka, visible because the coat sat so wrong on Shaq's frame that the collar stayed turned out. 2 words in black thread: Gerald Humphreys. A name. Someone else's name, not Shaq's. Shaq had not noticed it. Nobody at the gate had noticed it either, except one person, and that person had not yet done anything with what they saw. Second, tucked into the parka's left outer pocket, barely visible as a rectangular outline against the thin fabric, an envelope. The corner of it caught the gate's fluorescent light each time Shaq shifted his carry-on from one hand to the other. Third, at the far end of the jet bridge door, 40 feet past Marlene and past the line of boarding passengers, the cockpit door of the aircraft was open. Captain James Briggs, 51 years old, was standing in it with a cup of coffee, doing what pilots sometimes do during a delayed boarding, watching the gate with the patient, accumulated attention of a man who has been reading rooms from elevated positions for 26 years. He had not been asked to watch. He watched anyway. Now here is what nobody at Gate B14 understood yet. The coat had a history that had nothing to do with the airport. It had started 40 minutes earlier, outside Terminal S, in the October dark, where the temperature was 41 degrees and dropping. And the man at the center of everything that was about to happen. The reason a pilot would intervene. The reason a gate agent would make a radio call she had been waiting 19 years to make. The reason this story is still being told was not inside the building at all. He was sitting on a concrete planter outside the terminal entrance with no coat and no ticket and nowhere particular to be. And his name was Gerald Humphreys, and by the time the sun came up over Atlanta that morning, his life was going to be different, in ways he could not yet imagine. Stay with us for the entire video, because what Shaq did when the truth inside that collar finally surfaced is the reason this story spread to every corner of the internet, and why the pilot's decision had nothing to do with shock at all. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1972, and grew up understanding, before he had the language for it, that the world would make decisions about him based on what it saw before it saw anything else. He was large before it was useful. He was visible before he was ready. His mother, Lucille, gave him the interior life to survive that, the discipline, the grace, the specific capacity for stillness in rooms that wanted him to be loud. But it was his stepfather, Philip Harrison, who gave him the rule he carried longest. Philip was Army. quiet in the way of men who have learned that noise is what you make when you don't know what you're doing. He had one sentence, not advice, not a lecture, just one sentence he said so often across the years of Shaq's childhood that it stopped being a sentence and became something closer to the weather, something you dressed around every morning without noticing. Don't be a reaction. Be a response. He said it when Shaq came home from school furious about something a coach had done. He said it when a recruiter disrespected Lucille on a phone call Shaq overheard. He said it the morning Shaq left for El Soo, standing in the doorway of the apartment on the same block where he'd lived for 20 years, his arms crossed, his face doing what Philip's face always did, saying everything and nothing at the same time. Philip Harrison died in 2013. Shaq had not had a conversation with him since and also had not stopped having one. The man lived in the place where the important things live, too deep to visit on purpose, present anyway whenever they are needed. 4 NBA championships, 3 finals MVPs, a net worth north of $400 million, and on the morning of October 17, 2022, a $400 million man standing in a $30 Army surplus coat at an Atlanta airport gate, saying absolutely nothing. Because Philip Harrison had told him not to be a reaction. Marlene Coaster had been a flight attendant for 19 years, which is long enough to have seen everything and short enough to still be surprised when the everything finds a new shape. She was 51 years old. She had grown up in Marietta, Georgia, the daughter of a Delta ground crew supervisor who had spent 30 years loving an airline that thought of him as a labor cost. And she had entered the industry with the specific enthusiasm of someone who believes they understand what they are getting into and discovers, slowly, that they did not. She was good at the job. She had 2 commendations in her file, one for crisis management during a medical emergency, one for passenger communication during a diverted flight, and she had 2 complaints, the most recent of which, filed 6 weeks ago, was sitting in her HR file like a lit match near dry paper. The complaint was under review. She had been told verbally by her supervisor that another incident before the review concluded would be, in her supervisor's words, determinative. She had gone to bed the night before staring at the water stain on the ceiling of her Marriott room, doing the math the way people do, when they are one wrong move from losing the only career they have ever had. She had arrived at the gate at 5:50 a.m., 20 minutes before boarding, and had stood at the jet bridge door with the clipboarded authority of a woman who needed everything this morning to be simple and manageable, and exactly as it appeared. When the very large man in the very wrong coat reached the front of the line, something in her read the situation as the opposite of simple and manageable. She said, "Sir, I need to address the coat before you board." He said nothing. She said, "It's a safety and boarding concern. I need you to either check it at the desk or return to the gate." He said quietly, "It's a coat." She said, "Sir, the size and condition of the garment creates an obstruction risk in the aisle. I need you to step back from the door." She said it before she fully decided to say it. The second it left her mouth, she knew. The gate area had 214 people in it at various stages of boarding. One of them was a woman named Beverly Okafor, 58 years old. A gate agent for Delta's B Concourse for 22 years. She had worked the same stretch of gates since 2000, which meant she had worked them through 3 airline mergers, 2 recessions, a pandemic, and approximately 40,000 individual flights that all presented themselves as unique and were, in the aggregate, the same flight. Beverly had developed, across those 22 years, a very specific gift. She could read a gate situation the way a conductor reads a score, all the parts simultaneously, the ones playing and the ones about to play. She saw Marlene's posture. She heard the exchange. She looked at the man in the coat, and she recognized him immediately. Not because she was a fan, but because she was a professional, and because there was exactly one 7-foot man in the building, and he was standing at her jet bridge door, being told to step back. She also saw the collar of the coat. She saw the stitched name in it. She took out her radio. She did not call for backup the way Marlene expected. She called the cockpit. Captain James Briggs took the radio call at 6:38 a.m. Beverly's voice was even, the way the voice of a person who has waited 22 years for the right moment is even when the moment finally arrives. She said, "Captain, I need you to come to the door." That was all. He set down his coffee. He walked the jet bridge. He arrived at the door 40 seconds later and took in the scene with the unhurried assessment of a man who has been solving problems from cockpits since 1996. He looked at Marlene. He looked at the passenger. He looked at the coat. He said, "Sir, would you open the coat for me?" Shaq opened it. Captain Briggs leaned forward slightly and read what was stitched into the inside collar. 2 words. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Beverly. Beverly looked back at him. He said to Marlene, in a voice that was not raised and required no raising, "Please step inside and ask Janelle to cover boarding." Marlene started to speak. He said, "Please." She went. He turned back to the passenger and said, for the first time, "Mr. O'Neill, I'm sorry for the delay. I need to ask you something. And I need you to understand, it's not about the coat." Gerald Humphreys had been sleeping on and off since 3 a.m. on the concrete planter outside Terminal S. He was 67 years old. He had a good face, a face that had once been the face of someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, someone's oldest friend, and he was wearing, when Shaq found him at 5:55 a.m., a flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, and the particular stillness of a man who has learned to take cold as a given. Shaq had come through the terminal doors and seen him and stopped. He had asked if he was all right. Gerald had said he was fine. Shaq had sat down on the planter beside him, this enormous man in a $400 coat, sitting on a concrete planter at 5:55 in the morning in Atlanta, and they had talked for 11 minutes. About nothing specific, about Atlanta, about the cold. Gerald had mentioned, without complaint, that his coat had been taken 3 weeks ago, not by violence, just by the particular entropy by which homeless men lose things. Shaq had looked at him. He had taken off his own coat. Gerald had said no. Shaq had said, "Trade me." He held out his hand for Gerald's parka. Gerald had looked at him for a long moment and then taken off the olive-field coat and held it out. Shaq put it on. He gave Gerald his own coat. He picked up his carry-on bag and said, "Stay warm," and walked into the terminal. He had done it as a trade, because trades have dignity and gifts sometimes don't. He had been cold ever since, in a coat that ended at his ribcage. And he had not mentioned it to anyone, because there was nothing to mention. Gerald had a coat. That was the thing that mattered. Inside Gerald's parka pocket, inside the rectangular outline that had been catching the fluorescent light at the gate, was an envelope. Captain Briggs knew what was in it before he opened it, because he had been the one to write it. A letter to Gerald Humphreys, started 4 times and finished once, that Briggs had sealed and carried in his own flight bag for 4 months, through Atlanta and LAX and JFK and Denver, waiting for an address to send it to, which he had never found. His father, Robert Briggs, had died in February. At the service, every person Robert Briggs had ever mattered to had shown up, except one. Briggs had asked around. Nobody had seen Gerald in months. Somebody thought he might have moved. somebody else thought something worse. Briggs had carried the letter because carrying it was the only thing he could do with the not knowing. The letter said what the eulogy had said, but privately, the way you say things to the person who isn't there. It said that his father had talked about Gerald Humphreys his whole life. That Gerald was the one who had stayed the morning after Robert's first wife left and sat in the kitchen and made coffee and didn't say a word. And that Robert had said that morning had told him everything about what friendship actually was. It said, he looked for you at the end. I looked for you after. I would still like to find you, if you're willing to be found. This is where the two stories became one. Briggs had tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his flight bag after the funeral. Gerald had, at some point in the intervening months, come into possession of that flight bag. Briggs did not yet know how. Though he would find out later that his father's neighbor, cleaning out Robert's storage unit, had given Gerald a box of Robert's things, and the bag had been in it. Gerald had kept the bag until it was taken, along with everything else. He had kept the letter. He had transferred it, when the bag was gone, to the one thing he had left, the olive parka. It had been in the pocket for 3 months. It had been in Shaq's pocket for 40 minutes. It had been at Gate B14 the entire time, 40 feet from the man who wrote it, invisible inside a coat no one had looked at closely enough until Beverly Okafor read a collar. Captain Briggs stood at the jet bridge door with the envelope in his hand, and Shaq stood across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then, Briggs said, I need to find the man who was wearing this coat. Shaq said, I know where he is. Beverly was already on her radio. Before the plane pushed back, the boarding door had been held for 14 minutes. The 214 passengers on Flight 1847 to Los Angeles did not know why. Most of them were irritated. None of them would have believed the reason. Outside Terminal S, a gate agent, whose name nobody would remember, drove a courtesy cart to the concrete planter where Gerald Humphreys was still sitting, wearing a coat that had belonged to Shaquille O'Neal, and brought him inside to a Delta Sky Club on the B concourse, where Captain James Briggs was waiting at a table with 2 cups of coffee and an envelope. Shaq was there. Beverly was there. What was said at that table remained, by the agreement of everyone present, between the people who were present. What was not private was what came after. Gerald Humphreys was not without resources in the way people assume men in his situation are without resources. He had a daughter in Decatur he had not spoken to in 2 years, a separation built out of 1 bad year, and the specific pride of a man who did not know how to ask to come back. Captain Briggs, who was good at finding things when he knew what to look for, found the daughter's number in 40 minutes. Gerald made the call himself. Beverly, who had been watching all of it from a chair by the window, did not say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, she looked at Shaq and said, "You were just cold." He said, "That's all it was." She nodded. She said, "The coat did the rest." Before Shaq boarded the rescheduled departure, he went back outside to the planter where he had sat with Gerald that morning. Gerald had been taken to the Sky Club. The planter was empty. On it sat the olive field parka. Gerald had left it there, folded, when the gate agent brought him in. Shaq picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. He carried it back inside. He found Beverly and handed it to her and said, "Make sure he gets this back." She took it. She looked at the collar, at the stitched name. She folded it over her arm. She said, "I've worked this concourse for 22 years. I've never called the cockpit before." He said, "Why today?" She said, "Because I've been waiting for the right reason." Marlene Coaster completed mandatory retraining. She returned to active duty 4 months later. She was not fired, though the story as it traveled simplified what actually happened, the way stories do when they move faster than the facts. What was true was that she had been stood down from that flight, and that Captain Briggs had filed a full incident report, and that the review of her existing complaint had been resolved with additional training requirements. She completed them without complaint. She did not fully understand, for several weeks, why the coat had mattered to the captain. When she finally learned the whole story, she sat in her car in her driveway in Marietta for a while before going inside. She did not talk about it publicly. Some things a person has to sit with on their own. And Shaq. He boarded 3 hours late. He found his seat, which was a middle seat in coach, because he had booked last minute and there was nothing else available, which is the kind of detail that is both absurd and completely true. He put his carry-on in the overhead bin. He folded himself into the seat in the way that very tall men fold themselves into aircraft seats, with patience, with resignation, and with the specific peace of a man who has decided what kind of morning it was going to be and is not changing his mind now. He had no coat. He was still cold. He didn't mind. A gate agent who had worked the same concourse for 22 years and never called the cockpit proved that knowing when to act is worth 20 years of waiting for the right reason. A pilot who had been carrying a letter for 4 months through 17 cities proved that grief that has no address will find one eventually, when it is ready, and not before. A man named Gerald Humphreys, who had been sitting on a concrete planter in the October cold, proved that you cannot know, in the moment someone sits down beside you and says nothing important, what they are carrying on your behalf. And Shaquille O'Neal, cold, in a coat that ended at his ribcage, saying nothing at a jet bridge door because his stepfather taught him 40 years ago not to be a reaction, proved that the quietest response in the loudest room is almost always the one that changes everything. He did not raise his voice. He did not say his name. He stood there and let the coat speak 4 words before he handed it back. This one is Gerald's. Drop a comment and tell us about someone who sat down next to you at exactly the right moment. If this story moved you, the like button is right there. Subscribe and join a community that believes what you carry for other people always ends up carrying you somewhere you needed to go. There is one more story on the other side of this one. A coat, a different city, a different kind of cold. We will see you there.